You are listening to the APSE podcast, the Association of People Supporting Employment First, with your host, Chris Davies.
Hello, everyone out there, and welcome back to another Minnesota APSE podcast. Today is January 26, 2021. Happy New Year, everybody. And it also just happens to be my sister-in-law's birthday today. So shout out to Luann, wherever you are, and happy birthday to you. We're very excited for this podcast, and welcome especially to anyone new, anybody who stumbled upon APSE today. It is wonderful to have you. And of course, to all of our faithful longtime listeners and watchers, welcome back. It's the first podcast of the year. And I'm so excited. We have a great guest here with us today, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But her name is Alli Strong-Martin, and she's with Lifeworks. And we're going to learn a lot more about Alli here in just a minute. As per tradition, before we get started, I always like to just remind everybody a little bit about APSE by reciting our purpose statement that we have as an organization. Minnesota APSE is an action-oriented organization, and we exist to bring people together to raise expectations about employment for people with disabilities so they can contribute and assume their roles and responsibilities in their communities. Now, employment is the same wages, same standards, same expectations, responsibilities, and opportunities that are available to all working adults. We strongly believe, as does our guest here today, that employment, one person at a time, is indeed the avenue out of poverty and isolation. So thank you. Thank you for joining us again. And Alli Strong-Martin, hello. Happy New Year.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thank you for having me on today.
Thank you. We're so delighted to have you. Alli did a training for Minnesota APSE conference last October, and she really knocked it out of the park and was a big hit. And we knew that we had to invite her in for a podcast after that. So Alli is the business development assistant at Lifeworks. And why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Alli?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Chris, again. I currently work at Lifeworks on our new business development and innovation team. So most of our efforts in the past few years have centered around disability inclusion. And just a little bit about Lifeworks in case you don't know, or folks out there listening haven't heard of us. Lifeworks was founded in 1965 by families who recognize the importance of advocacy and breaking down barriers for people with disabilities to be a part of our communities. And today we are really committed to self-determined support, careers with competitive wages, and developing really innovative opportunities that enhance people's lives. Part of that work is that we do offers employment services for people with disabilities. And on my team, the business development team, we really learn from that long history. We're working both internally on our own organizational culture and our own learning, as well as externally with other disability organizations, other employers, and community partners in order to make our communities more accessible, equitable, and more inclusive places for people with disabilities to live and work. And I've been with Lifeworks only since 2019. And that's the same year that I graduated with my master's degree in human rights from the University of Minnesota. And before that, I earned my bachelor's degrees in nonprofit leadership and international studies from Murray State University in Murray, Kentucky. And I got first started in disability services working in a direct support role at an outdoor recreational camp for children and teens with disabilities in my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. And since then, I've worked on supporting different international disability rights programming, and again, studied disability rights in undergraduate and graduate school. And the last thing I'll say in this introduction is that I do want to mention that I come into this space with my own experience of disability, in that I have a mental health related disability, which is what many call a non-apparent or an invisible disability. And I talk about this when I introduce myself for different presentations and trainings, because especially for this one, because it relates to what we'll talk about later. But for me, I mention this is that I have the privilege of being able to, quote, pass in most social settings as being non-disabled. And I have the privilege of being able to choose whether or not I disclose my mental health conditions. And therefore, I get to prepare myself for any potential bias or judgment. And not everyone with a disability has that privilege that I do. And so, again, we'll talk about this more later, but with the social model of disability, it says that people are not really, quote, disabled by the features of their, individual unique bodies or minds, but by barriers in our communities and in our society. And so the last thing I'll say is that you might notice that I might kind of interchange while we're having this conversation by referring to people with disabilities as like they, or I might refer to them as we, and include myself in that. But I do recognize that in almost always when I come into a space and in professional spaces is that I'm not automatically what I'll talk about, quote unquote, disabled by society. So that was a long introduction, but that's all about me.
That's a wonderful introduction. Not too long at all, and such an incredible journey you've already had. And if you don't mind me saying it, it's your sort of in a lot of ways just on the precipice of this world and your career and all the things you're going to discover. But what a journey you've already had, and so glad that it led you to us, here today. Yeah. So Alli alluded, thank you. Alli alluded to the models. She talked about the social model, and Alli talks about 4 models, theoretical models of disability that really impact how society views disability. And Alli will correct me in all the ways I'm wrong here in a second, but how society views disability and how that impacts all aspects of life for everyone. And today we're specifically going to be, because of APSE's mission, we're going to be specifically drawing those back to how they, affect employment. And there are 4 models. And again, Alli will correct me if I'm wrong, but she's going to talk about the medical model, as well as the charity model, the social model, and the human rights model. Did I get all that right?
Yeah, you got it right.
All right. Awesome. So Alli's going to start out by talking a little bit about the medical model, and then we're going to just keep going from there. So take her away. Tell us about the medical model, Alli.
Yeah, that sounds good. So first I'll start out by giving just a quick description of what I mean and what others mean, because by no means am I the first person to come up with all of these models. So I'll be citing a lot of different organizations and individuals as kind of sources that I've learned this information from. So what we mean when we talk about theoretical models. So by that, we mean frames of reference, which have emerged in both academic research done by both people with disabilities and people without disabilities, as well as a lot of just commentary from the lived experience of people with disabilities who, whether or not they're in, academia or, hold advanced degrees or anything, they're just communicating about their own experiences, navigating communities as people with disabilities. So over time, the models that we're going to talk about have helped communities and society frame disability and understand people with disabilities in some negative ways that we'll talk about first. But then also there's room mostly that have been put forth by people with disabilities themselves. There's really room for positive growth and how we can use these models to move forward into the future. And I did this a little bit already in my introduction, but in this first couple sections on the medical model specifically, I'm going to probably preface some different phrases or things that I talk about with the word quote, and I'll say it out loud for access purposes, but kind of using those air quotes with my fingers because I think some of this history and the phrases are really hard to talk about and they're really hard to think about. And in no way do I want what I say here or what we talk about here to be, defining who people with disabilities really are. So when I make kind of like this really intentional demonstration of saying quote, that's what I'm trying to think about there. But I do think though, even that's hard to dwell on some of this history, it is important for us to be able to have these kind of, I call them constructively critical conversations, because I do think it can be easy for disability service providers, other disability organizations, and even non-disabled people in general to kind of gloss over a lot of this history or to pretend like some of these views aren't still present with us here today. So I'll dive in now into more about the medical model specifically. And the medical model is one of the most common views of disability still in our society today. And in short, it views people with disabilities as people who need to be fixed. They might be viewed as, quote, broken or as deviating from normal health status. Who defines normal is, up for debate in a lot of these talks about the medical model. But one of the sources that I've really learned a lot from is a website magazine kind of publication called Disabled World, and they state that the medical model sees that disability is a problem of an individual person that's caused by disease or other health condition, which therefore they say requires sustained medical care provided in the form of individual treatment by professionals. So I think that that ties into a lot of, disability services. And we've been talking about that at Lifeworks internally. And we've also been, again, dealing with this history that it wasn't very long ago in our country's history when people with disabilities were viewed as so deviating from the norm or were viewed as so quote unquote sick that they were involuntarily segregated into institutions. And one of the things I'll mention to wrap up kind of this overview of the medical model is also citing a really great resource that's local to Minnesota, but obviously on the internet, you can access it from anywhere that you're listening into. But the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities created this really great historical educational project called Parallels in Time. And they go really into deep detail about how a lot of these institutions were literally called hospitals. And that really, for me, made that direct comparison to this history of the medical model under which people with disabilities are perceived to be sick, or as in needing to be fixed to some previously defined state of normalcy.
And how do you think the medical model has impacted employment for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think, during this time in history, when we're talking about this, people with disabilities did work in some capacities, and it kind of varied state by state. But when I've really focused on institutions, specifically that time in history, we know that most cases in institutions, employment and work was not a choice, but rather it was more like forced labor almost. And so the Parallels in Time project also details how people with disabilities were used, in these institutions as free labor to care for other inmates in these institutions, and or to just be productive for the institutions itself. So that's kind of the history part that I see impacted early employment, but we wouldn't call it employment. And in addition to history, currently I've been learning a lot about the medical model and the role that it's played in the stigma and the deeply entrenched bias that still exists today when it comes to people with disabilities being able to obtain integrated and competitive employment. And the National Black Disability Coalition, an organization that I've learned a lot from over the past year, they talk about that the individual with disabilities is in the sick role under the medical model. And they talk about that when people are sick, they are excused from these normal obligations of society. And their examples they list are like going to school, getting a job, taking on family responsibilities. And so that connection to, viewing people with disabilities as somehow being sick or in need of treatment, that kind of it is a real barrier to I think people's perceptions of what people with disabilities can do in terms of employment. And one of the other connections, and the last thing I'll mention right now, that the National Black Disability Coalition makes, is that I thought was really interesting in kind of terms of modern and, in the last couple decades landscape, is that they made the connection of the correlation between the medical model and public policy related to disability. So they make the direct connection to the Social Security system, in which disability is defined as the inability to work. And so they, on their resources, they really make that connection. And I think that I see that through coworkers and colleagues who have been in the disability employment services for a long time, is that also ties to some issues and concerns that we hear from people with disabilities themselves, who really want to work, but they also don't know how that's going to impact their maybe public benefits or their healthcare coverage, or access to different services. So I think that it's definitely tied to both this kind of history, and the medical model also still shows up and still creates some problems for employment today.
Sure, absolutely, very, very well stated. And just to sort of add on my perspective, which is very similar to some of the things you just said, and would you say it'd be fair to say that the medical model and the paradigm it created for employment even today has continued to kind of perpetualize people's beliefs about what people with disabilities can do in terms of employment out in the community? And it's still something I think we're still struggling with even today. But we'll get into more more of that in a minute. And, since you mentioned the benefits and that a lot of people are, and you're correct when you say a lot of folks are concerned about working because they're concerned about how it will affect their benefits. I just happened to attend a training with the Work Incentives Connection last week. And so there are great resources out there. So for anybody watching today that when Alli said that, it sort of caught their attention or a light bulb went off in their head. Some great resources are the Work Incentives Connection through Goodwill and also Disability Benefits 101. So you can just go to db101.org to start learning and figuring out who to connect with. And our advice from the organization I work for, which is Kaposia, is to always go to those experts. And it's always a good idea to talk to those benefit experts at those two places, one of those two, and really get the right information. In a nutshell, you're always better off working. You're always you can work, and there are things you need to know, but you're always better off working. So, okay, so let's move into the next model that Alli's going to talk about for us today. Or I don't mean to say it that way, like you're not here. Hi, Alli. All right, Alli, why don't you talk about the social model?
The social model, or would you want me to start?
No, I'm sorry.
You're good.
Thank you. See, somebody's paying attention. No, please. The next model is the charity model. Tell us more about that.
That sounds good. The charity model has really close ties to the medical model that we just were talking about, but typically people talk about the charity model as being distinct, but again, it has really close ties. The charity model is also known as the tragedy model. And I think that people call it that for a reason, because under this way of thinking, communities and society paint a picture of people with disabilities as kind of being tragic victims, or that we, meaning mainstream society, believe that, people with disabilities deserve to be pitied, or the charity model also depicts people with disabilities as needing, requiring to be, quote, taken care of. And that means typically by non-disabled people or professionals. And the charity model is also closely tied to what Stella Young, she had a TED Talk back in 2014, which is 7 years now, and I can't believe that. But Stella Young in 2014 was calling this, we might have, heard about it in other places too, but she calls it inspiration porn. And she means that, like, oftentimes media, and if we're being honest, nonprofits and different organizations even can do this too, is portray people with disabilities in a way that we think that disability is something that has to be overcome. And that when disability is overcome, that is something that's inspirational, or it's like a feat that has been accomplished. And so what I loved about Stella Young's TED Talk way back again in 2014 was she contrasted this again with that social model that we'll get into in a couple minutes. But Stella said really explicitly that she did not need to overcome any part of her individual body or mind. But what she did need to overcome, was the real barriers to inclusion and access that her community and that society more broadly has created for people with disabilities, from participating in things like public life and politics, general access to their community, and then also, like we'll get into, work and employment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you and I would definitely agree that the charity model is not our favorite of the models, and does really have that pitying overtone for an individual. And I can think back to even my career, and when I started, which was just about 24 years ago, just talking about hard to believe, you're talking about 2014. So I got into this field in 1997. I was 6 years old at the time. And I think the way this model, this overarching, theoretical model of charity, sort of manifested itself in employment was, we were still spending time going out and trying to get, contracts, if you will, from companies that where we could bring work to a location and have people do that work, simple work, thinking that, well, maybe that's all people can do. And I mean, where I work, we don't think that way. We believe in everyone's potential, certainly. But even us 24 years ago, we're still caught a little bit in that paradigm. And going back to our former comments, it's still perpetuating itself, today. So
for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let's move on to the one I was already jumping ahead at a little bit ago, and maybe it's because I'm so social. I just wanted to talk about the social model. I know they're not the same things, but tell us more about the social model, Alli.
Yeah, that sounds good. So the social model really flips the medical model on its head, and it's been really impactful for me as I'm working through, in the last, couple of years about what we think about disability and how that, as professionals, how that impacts the delivery of the programs and services that we both design and then that actually impact people's lives. So social model flips medical model directly on its head. And it really first emerged in the 1980s. And very importantly, the social model was first articulated and described by people with disabilities themselves, in many ways as basically a critique of what we just talked about, the charity and the medical models approach to disability. And the social model also played a really important role in the disability rights movement, which we'll talk about more last. But for now, the social model is so important because it focuses again on these access barriers that are created by mainstream society. So any problems that are associated with disability only exist because society has been organized in an exclusive way rather than an inclusive way. And one of the researchers that I've learned from in recent years, her name's Teresa Degener, and she writes about that through the social model, people with disabilities themselves created a framework that they recognized that many of the challenges that they faced rested with the decisions and actions that society took and not with themselves or not with the individual features of their own bodies or minds. And I think for people with disabilities, like that's really liberating. Even with my own mental health disability, that's really liberating for me to think about that it's nothing, any problems that I might face are not because something's wrong with me or that something needs to be fixed about me, but all of it kind of, I'm more disabled by society's perceptions and bias and inaccessibility than because of individual features of my mind or other people's who might have physical disabilities, their bodies. So I think that that's the social model is super powerful in when it was first articulated. And people who subscribe to the social model, they kind of look around and they question, they look at their communities, and they say, what if people with disabilities were actually just those with individual differences who are actually disabled by society? And so we've talked a lot about on my team at Lifeworks is that disability is really a normal part of life. And when you look at the statistics worldwide, when you look at disability is something that's fluid, that you can kind of any person can enter into the identity category of disability at any time in their life. The social model is really impactful again, that it's like, it's nothing that's wrong with people with disabilities. It's something needs to be changed in society. And I think one of the most important things that I'll wrap up about the social model, just the quick description of it, is that disability in this way, when we reframe it like this, can be understood as, and this is from another researcher called Jenny Morris. Jenny Morris says, then we can understand disability as itself like discrimination, in terms that we also talk about other systems of oppression like racism and sexism. And so when we understand it, disability under the social model, we can really start to have more of those conversations, and we can really start to talk about, again, society rather than just the unique bodies and minds and differences and diversity of individuals themselves.
Yeah, there's so much really important and impactful stuff there in what you just talked about, and you're right. I've always believed and known that disability is a demographic that any of us can join at any time, And I really appreciate, what you say about your disability that's not apparent. And so you are able to pass as somebody without a disability. I've lived with an anxiety disorder since I was 25. And what was really hard at the beginning was just the perception I believe people would have of me if they knew that I had an anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And so, that is all so true and so powerful. And this particular model had a tremendous impact on organizations like the one I work for, as well as APSE. It was really in the 1980s when those pilot projects for supported employment started to happen, just as this model was becoming more prevalent. And organizations in Minnesota, such as Kaposia, got involved in some of these supported employment pilot projects, which really laid the foundation to where we are today with customized employment practices. And in 1990, these influences really, created a group of professionals to organize, and people with disabilities to organize APSE as a way to have a stronger voice and to advocate for employment. And if you hadn't figured out from our purpose statement, APSE is the only, and I'm not saying this to you, Alli, so much as just to everybody in general, our listeners, APSE is the only national, and of course state chapter membership organization that solely promotes integrated competitive employment, one person, one job at a time. So all those things were very impactful on the beginning of APSE and supported employment in general. So I was very fortunate, like you, to join a great organization, and one that was, a member of APSE and really trying to push the envelope in employment. So that's great. That's great. Yeah.
I was gonna talk for a second, if you don't mind, just about I realized that I didn't mention earlier kind of how I was going to talk about, like you just did, about supported employment, about some of the things that I see that the social model has impacted employment. But I wanted to contrast a couple ways in which the charity model itself really kind of shows up still today, because I think when I reflect on how I see the charity model, and just this big contrast again, like you're saying, like it was like a big shift in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, like right when APSE and Minnesota APSE were starting to be developed in our and come together. And I think that we have come a long way. And I think that one of the things, though, at the same time is that we can't, and I think that you, Chris, do a really good job talking about it, is like we have come a long way, but there's still a long way we have to go. And that even when we say we've come a long way, that doesn't mean that we can't, like look back and think about how some of these models, like the charity and medical model, impacted employment. And I think one of the things that we've seen change is like career progression and leadership opportunities for people with disabilities. And I think the great thing that that we can be influenced by in the social model is, like providing those, and not just thinking, you talked about earlier, that there's only a certain type of job that that people with disabilities can fulfill, and that we want to hear from people with disabilities themselves about what they're interested in and what they see their strengths as, and how they want to use those strengths. And I think that the social model itself, kind of wrapping this part up, is, again, like we've come a really long way, but I think the social model, there's a lot of potential that I don't know if disability service organizations ourselves, if we've fully kind of grasped this this potential that it offers us. And a lot of the things that we talk about on my team are, thinking about if the social model was really truly lived out by disability service professionals and the communities that we're a part of. We think about things like, would there be a need if barriers were all removed in our communities? Would there be a need for us and for job coaches in the first place? And so I get really excited thinking about this potential that the social model offers us, while learning from, exactly like you said, about the beginnings of supported employment and the movement that it took us into today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. Yeah. Our dream is that we don't have to exist, that working and participating in one's community is a normal fabric of life. And that, if we're all operating at those higher models, or society is in general, we could get there. So that's still our dream, is to not exist. And I guess then I could go pursue my professional surfing career in Hawaii at that point, but not until then.
Not until then.
That's right. So, all right, great. Thank you, Alli. So, okay, so we have one more model that you're going to talk to us about, and that is the human rights model.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
This is where I get the most excited. Again, I tried to contain my excitement a little bit in the social model, but I get really excited talking about human rights model, but they both are really intertwined. So the social model paved the way for the human rights model, and that time period of the 1980s that the social model was really articulated. We know in our country's history, the disability-led activism that was happening in the 80s and in the 60s and in the 70s. So people with disabilities were advocating for their rights themselves. And I think that it's important to mention, in addition to this, this fact that disability rights is disability led, is that so much of what we now call things like accessibility or social inclusion would not have been handed over nicely by non-disabled or mainstream society, but rather it was really fought for by people with disabilities themselves, and they really led the way. And and they were kind of demanding that they be seen as equal members of society. And the human rights model is it comes out of that disability activism. And the human rights model itself talks about that people with disabilities have the same civil, political, economic, and social rights as other people without disabilities. And I think that the human rights model builds upon, again, that progress made by the social model, because just saying that there's barriers in society, like the social model does, is only kind of one part of this inclusion puzzle. And that the human rights model goes further, and people with disabilities kind of fought for these civil rights legislation, which is what the human rights model is grounded in. Some of those that we know from history, it could be like the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 that we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of last year. And then I will spare you the many minutes of conversation that I could go into, but it even goes beyond the US too. So I get really excited about, and what my graduate school studies were in primarily were on an international level. So there's even human rights models grounded in international human rights treaties. One is specifically about disability, and it's called the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that one is really cool on an international level because people with disabilities from all around the world came together in the early 2000s, and they were organizing and debating with one another about what rights to put in this treaty. And they all came together and they got that treaty passed in, it entered into force in 2008. So it's one of the newer international human rights treaties. And just some of the things that I talk about, again, I will try to spare, all of
That's okay. We love it.
together. But yeah, in that like international treaty and in both domestic laws with disability rights, we kind of see different sides of there's this freedom from. So you might see different civil rights laws say people with disabilities have freedom from, discrimination or exploitation, or, freedom from violence. You have the right to be free from violence. But then there's also these rights too. And one of the articles that's found both internationally and then, in those civil rights protections that I talked about earlier is the right to work and employment. And so I think that it's really important that both we recognize that the people with disabilities have the right to work and employment on an equal basis with others. And that's both grounded in domestic, so US based legislation and protections, but also that the things that we're working on in this sector and the things that people with disabilities themselves are advocating for, it goes beyond the US too, and it's bigger than the US, and we get to be, I think it's an honor and a privilege that we get to be a part of that. And I think that the human rights model also, it takes us away in a really great way, an important way, from this view that, in the charity and medical model, it could be seen as that disability employment is just a nice thing or a charitable thing to do. But what you've talked about, Chris, and that I know Minnesota APSE believes too, is that employment is so much more than a nice or a charitable thing to do. It like really impacts people's lives and their their livelihoods. And it's so much more than that. And so I think that in addition to that too, the human rights model takes us beyond. I'm going to do a shout out to one of my colleagues at Lifeworks. She says that the social model is kind of the facts of life, that just saying that society was not built or structured with people with disabilities in mind. But the human rights model pushes society to kind of act on those facts. And so, again, we can recognize that there's barriers to employment for people with disabilities, but things like inaccessible policies or bias or stigma or ableism are not going to be necessarily, just overcome by saying that they exist. We actually have to take action against those to make, employment a more accessible reality for people with disabilities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here. I can just feel everybody, standing up and clapping right now. And just look under the, APSE logo there, as I'm down here, as I like to call it, the cellar for this podcast, and the employment first, employment for all. There's no doubt that the human rights model has been a huge influencer in the employment first policies that we have throughout the country, including here in Minnesota, and that employment is a right, and it's not something you should have to opt into. But should you decide you don't want to work for whatever reason, maybe something you opt out of, so that employment is always the expected and preferred outcome. So people don't have to fight for that right, because that is an inalienable right. So, yeah, well done. I think too, it's had a huge impact just in terms of practices right now, today's practices of customized employment, which more and more professionals and individuals themselves are using as a method of getting employment. The human rights model has had a huge impact, on that. With customized employment, it's a step. It goes a step beyond some of the traditional supported employment paradigms, and truly is strength-based. Always starts with the person, so really empowers the person to be the one that leads towards the type of employment, the type of careers they want, versus just saying, well, let's go out and see what we can find and see what you might want to plug yourself into. It's a really different way of looking at it, and it's creating, job opportunities that are very real and meaningful, for people. Because as you said, Alli, employment brings tremendous value to one's life.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter whether you are somebody who is perceived to have a disability or somebody who's not perceived to have a disability. Employment will bring value to your life. I think you and I would both say that our employment brings huge value to our lives in many, many ways.
For sure.
We could spend another hour just talking about that. But yes, this model that you talk about, I think we all hope becomes and continues to stay as the strongest theoretical model to continue just pushing towards quote unquote normalcy, whatever that is. I know I don't consider myself normal, and I'm proud of it, but everybody should have the right to work that wants to work, and that's really what it's all about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, do you have any other just words of wisdom that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I don't know about wisdom, but I'll try to wrap up with just me being new to this field and learning from folks like you, Chris. And I know we've joked about, that you've been in it for a long time, but I think that there's a lot of things that we can all learn from one another. And I think that one of my favorite things about these different models of disability is that it does allow us to simultaneously reflect on history and say, oh, wow, look at how far we've come. But it also pushes us at the same time to, again, not sit in that space and just pat ourselves on the back. And we're always moving forward. And I think that that's something that I hear people with disabilities talking about in terms of the things that they want non-disabled professionals and non-disabled advocates to really think about is they're like, come on, we can keep doing better, and there's more that we can improve upon. And one of the things that I think tied in when I was thinking about how to wrap this up is that I think that there's really more things that we can, again, keep pushing ourselves to be doing in our sector in order to really truly align with a lot of the principles of disability rights. I think it's totally possible. And one of the things that I've been really dwelling on is something that actually one of our local leaders in the disability field from the ARC Minnesota, Andrea Zuber, their president, she gave a testimony at the Minnesota Senate last year, and it was really, really powerful. And she talked about that, this idea that in the past 4 decades, we've created basically what she called a parallel universe for people with disabilities that to live and work in. And I think that that's something that we are able to see is influenced by those charity and medical models. But Andrea Zuber's testimony is she says we need to keep pushing forward with the social and the human rights models in order to address that parallel universe, and that's not that's not okay, and that's not what true inclusion and belonging is. And so again, I think that there's still a lot of work. I'm excited about the work. I think our sector is more than capable of doing the work, and I think that comes with being humble and self-reflective and having some of these hard conversations. And I think that there's some big challenges for the disability services sector around, really big concepts like disability rights and systems of ableism and, different parts of social oppression that we all play a role in. And I think that there's some really big challenges ahead in the coming years. I don't think that theoretical models of disability are the only way by any means to confront those big challenges, but I think that it's been a good tool for me, and I've just been really privileged to be able to share some of that with you and the listeners here. And again, I think there's work to do, but I think we're ready for it. We're excited for it. And I think that the 2020s and beyond will be a time of real growth and progress. So again, thank you for having me on here, Chris. It's been really great.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Alli. It really is our privilege, to have you here today. And I'm glad you mentioned Andrea Zuber. She's somebody who started in the field about the same time I did, and actually worked for Kaposia for a period of time, who I work for now, has always been a member of Minnesota APSE. And so all of us at APSE are very proud of the work Andrea's done, from Ramsey County to Dakota County to what she's doing with ARC Minnesota now. She's had a tremendous impact. And, I'll put a plug in for her late father. Her father actually was one of the huge influencers of deinstitutionalization in Minnesota, and getting people out of the regional treatment centers and into homes in the community. So a lot of great work. And as you said, a lot of great work still to do. We got to keep this train rolling, as I like to say. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but have you ever thought about writing a book? Or do you have any plans to write a book?
I would love to write a book. I've thought about it a couple times. So
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, just assume I want to be on the pre-order list. Okay.
All right. I will,
Yeah,
Chris.
and if you start like a Kickstarter campaign or, early buy, early purchase opportunities, put me on the list.
At the top.
Yeah, please put me at the very top. You bet. And I want a signed copy as well.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you so much. I just want to say too, when I started, as I joke about a long time ago, I was the young, if you want to say that, person, the new person, in the field. And I learned from people like Bob Nemec, Dale DeLeo, John Alexander, Jackie Milnarczyk, more names than I can mention. And I would forget so many, the Heidi Mahans of the world, all sorts of people were my mentors and my guide. And I thought, maybe at that time I brought a little energy to their mission and to what they were trying to accomplish. And for us to get there, we truly do need people like you, smart, energetic, good head on your shoulders, who want to do the work and want to join in the work, because it takes all of us. And life is a cycle. Time marches on, and it's always great to see people like you. It really does give me hope and belief that we truly, truly can get closer and closer to what our dream is, with people like you, joining in this movement. So thank you so much, Alli.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll just close, as I like to do, with one of my favorite sayings out there to everybody. Again, thank you to Alli Strong-Martin for being here today with us. And on behalf of all of our production crew at Minnesota APSE, who makes these podcasts possible, just remember, if you can believe it, you can achieve it. We'll see you next time.